Welcome to Hello Player, a show for curious people who want an honest look at making a video game. I'm your host, Evva Carr, and in this episode we'll be talking about how to make people feel something about shapes, honestly, anything about shapes, or anything towards shapes in general. So let's get started. Shapes.
Squares.
Triangles.
Pentagons?
What else is there?
There's crosses. Goodness sake. Stars. Oh, anyway. All right. Awkward intro aside.
I'm super curious, Charles. Like, you had... so the first time that I had, like, ever played HyperDot, I had always felt like... This almost sounds like a little bit romantic, but it's like, I felt like you were talking to me. Like, through... This is so stupid, but I felt like you were kind of talking to me through each of the levels. I have no clue why. And at least like that first time I was like, whoa, this is really weird. It feels really weird. It feels really different. Was that ever your intention to like make people feel anything about shapes at the beginning when you were starting to design your game?
No. When I was,
I love that.
Yeah. When I was first starting, it was really just to, make the deadline for that project.
The 4 days.
Yeah, the 4 days.
Yeah.
After that, then it was, if there was any feelings towards shapes, it was more like, oh, this is a square. This is how I'm supposed to avoid this. Oh, this is a triangle. I do this one around that. It wasn't like I vehemently hate triangles and everything that they stand for. Like, that was not a thing that I was going for. But I have now seen that a lot of people have certain feelings towards certain shapes in that game.
How many were in the original? I can't even remember anymore.
Oh, sure.
So there are currently 5 total.
Yes.
Can you believe that? There's 5.
There are 5
total.
There are 5 shapes.
And there's over 100 levels.
And there are over 100 levels.
Wild. Anyways.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, were there initially 5?
No. Initially there was only 3. It was squares, hexagons, and triangles.
Yeah, now I remember. Those crosses came in afterwards.
Yes, crosses came in after and stars came in after.
Yeah.
The reason why there was a hexagon was because in the original prototype, it was a hexagon. But then I switched it over to a pentagon because pentagons have a point, which help indicate the direction that they're going, versus having a hexagon, which has, it's not clear which way they're going.
Got it. Yeah.
But yeah. Same thing with like triangles. Triangles have a really clear, I'm going in this direction because I'm an arrow. So that's so yeah, that's why that they are shaped the way they are.
Wait, when did you end up like caring about how people felt about? Did you? These are your own words, by the way. You said like you wanted to make people feel things about shapes, and I realized like you just said no. You didn't think of that at the beginning.
Yeah, definitely not at the beginning. It was more when I got like my first haters for shapes.
Who were they and what were they? Tell me more.
When I first started the game, when I first started the game, people did not like the stars or the triangles the most because they home in on you and they are constantly following you for a short period of time. But there weren't like haters. There weren't like, I will be proactive and stand out with a picket fence and be like, I hate triangles. It wasn't until I actually added in like the single player campaign.
Yeah.
That was when people actually started disliking things.
Got it.
Intensely. Because then I like actually designed levels specifically because of, I'll make one with a whole bunch of triangles, or I'll make one with a whole bunch of squares and stuff like that. And it was at that point where people propped up and was like, oh, triangles suck, and like explicitly called them out. I don't remember the very first hater. That one's a harder one to find.
The only one that I remember is, oh God, how many times are we going to bring this person up? Your brother.
Yep, I know. Yeah.
About crosses.
Yeah, my brother is probably the reason why crosses are the second most hated enemy is like largely on the shoulders of my brother. where he's like, oh, crosses or randomness. I don't like that. Yeah, so like crosses definitely every shape has its own like hater. I've also like recently on Twitter I was talking about one of my friends from college was like, I hate Pentagon so much.
I remember that, and then they went in and like deleted it out of the code.
Yeah.
Wait, how did they even get a hold of that?
I was working in a virtual reality lab back in college, and we worked together. And I often worked on HyperDot in that lab. So while like they were often like play testers, and they had a lot of experience with pentagons, and a lot of hate towards them. Eventually they were like, no, delete these. And then I was working on this. And then they were like, you just need to go into the code. And then he started to grab my mouse and then started going through my project. And I was like, no, you have to go over there. And then you click that. And then you have to press that to delete. It was great. I was dying. And then they made their own build, and they have their own special build somewhere.
Wait, so someone actually still has a build without the pentagons?
I am assuming this was when there was only 50 levels. I was at the 50 level mark. And yeah, they took out all the ones.
If you're listening, could you please send that to us? Like, I actually really want that build. I'd love to see what that looks and feels like.
So,
Wait, do you have any, like, I can't think of them right now. Are there any levels that have just exclusively pentagons in them?
Yes, there's
so
quite a few. So then you just, for like 30 seconds, you're just sitting there. It's like, yeah.
There's a black market version of HyperDot where there are no pentagons.
Oh my goodness.
So yes, if you're listening, please send us that build. I would love to get my hands on it and play it. I think it's hilarious.
Yeah, but yeah, it's like there's definitely been like key haters for each one. And I don't want to say that fuels me, but I do get some joy.
You are so ridiculous. You're the nicest, kindest human and the worst game designer and developer. You like, oh, it's fine. I'm going to back up.
So
we can
good.
get back on track and talk a little bit about, I don't know, other things outside of me being like, you're the worst.
All good.
Talk to me a little bit about like, what you were thinking of when you were making like the enemies, like combining them or anything of sorts. Like you have a bunch of different levels that have a bunch of different enemies in them. Talk to me about them.
Yeah. So when I originally made the first two levels that were in the original prototype, I knew that I would just build up on having a whole bunch of enemies all at one time. I didn't have it so that like I can time them or anything other than I can time them when they come in, but I can't stop them after they come in. Like they're going to just keep on spawning indefinitely because I didn't have the tech for that. I didn't know what I was doing at that point. So I was just like, all right, here's a bunch of squares. And then 5 seconds later, here's some pentagons.
Yeah.
And then like 10 seconds later, triangles, stuff like that. I had some type of feeling of like, squares are the easier ones and triangles are harder, just based off of the amount of complexity that they are.
Yeah.
It was more like, I'm just building on difficulty versus me building on level design. And it wasn't until I started doing the single player levels where I incorporated, what if I combined these two things, or I combined the fact that squares are like rigid and they're walls and they're obstacles that you can avoid like fairly easily, but with the fact that there are triangles that are like following you and you have to try and run away from them.
What were some of the original ones that you had kind of like made? I like each level, like especially the earlier levels that you were kind of making in the single player campaign, which ones did you make first, and then when did you start combining them?
Sure. Actually, the very first level that I ever made is an infamous one. It was.
Wait, which one is this?
It was Endurance.
Oh my God! What? That was one of the first you ever made.
That was the first one that I ever made. So Endurance is like near the top in terms of a difficulty. And
Meaning it's much later in the game.
yeah, it's way later in the game.
And if Becca from Xbox is listening to this, it was also the level that you had played for like 45 minutes.
Yeah. So actually, it's been nerfed over the years.
That was your first level?
But yeah, that was my first level.
Okay.
It was, yeah. So that one is a combination of all three of the enemies, but like it was more like that same philosophy that I was talking about with the original two, where I was like, okay, I start out with these, and then I introduce this, and then I introduce this. It wasn't really about, or it was sort of like messing around with, oh, what happens if I had a square and a triangle and doing things. But it wasn't like explicitly that. But that was like the first time that I like was like, oh, what happens if I made like patterns and stuff?
Yeah.
And the patterns really didn't even show up until just like messing around with timing of when enemies show up.
Yeah, so what are kind of like the different categories, right? So I'm hearing you say there's timing for like when something spawns and then it goes out.
Yeah.
There's like the speed at which, you know, some of these enemies come out.
Right.
What else is there?
Yeah, so there's the timing that they're out, the speed, the angle at which they come out.
Yeah, and that's how you create some of those patterns, I'm assuming.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's super like coming up with or coming to that realization that I'm able to make those type of patterns. Because I wasn't originally thinking that.
Yeah.
That was like eye opening and really just like I was like, oh, what if I did this, or what if I tried to? How can I try and make this pattern and stuff like that? Because it was just like super interesting just to try and figure out how do I make a whatever in HyperDot versus some other game and stuff like that. But yeah, it was a lot of like interesting figuring out timing and like how what different parameters and knobs to tweak in order to actually make these like weird and cool patterns.
You mentioned just a second ago that you didn't recognize that you could make patterns early on.
Yeah.
When did you end up discovering that? And did that change the way that you were making these levels?
Yeah, it was really endurance. That was the one that really made me like, oh, I'm actually making a pattern versus me just randomly doing a thing. Well, not necessarily random, but like me haphazardly being like, okay, I want it to generally be in this area and stuff like that. It was I initially had the idea for endurance where I was like, oh, what if I made it so that one enemy spawns at this angle and then like 15 degrees down another enemy spawns a little later, and then I just kept doing that as it goes around the circle. And I wasn't thinking of what the result would be. I was thinking, oh, that'd be interesting to see. But then I found out what the result would be. Yeah. Which it makes an interesting circle boulder pattern kind of thing. Yeah. And from there, I was like, oh, that's a thing that I can actually make.
Was that also around the same time that you ended up doing the level editor? Like, did you make it around the same time as Endurance?
Yes. So that was actually, Endurance was the first thing that I made when I was making efforts to make a proper level editor.
Got it. Okay. And so were you experimenting with the level editor when you started making Endurance then? So was that like the first level that you had made in Endurance, or that you had made in the level editor?
Yes. That would be the first one. It looked nothing like it does in the final game.
Yeah.
It was this was when it was still outside of the game. It was still like inside of I use Unity. So it was inside of Unity, and it was not like you were not running the game and stuff. So I had to like manually type in all of these things and then click the play button, wait for a bit while it loads, and then go into that level, test it out, and it'd be like, oh, whoops, I forgot I put a 2 instead of a 3, and then pause the game or like close the game and stop the game, go back, tweak the thing, press the button, wait for a little bit. It was a long, tedious process, which helped inspire me to be like, okay, I need to make a an in-game version of this.
It almost feels like those two things, just from like listening to it, like started a complete shift in the way that you were making some of your levels. Like, what were they like before? And then did you end up just seeing a lot more patterns post level editor?
Yeah. After I made like a more proper level editor, totally saw more patterns.
Okay.
Because the level editor helped facilitate a lot of like me being like, oh, what if I did this? And then I just do like a small tweak in the level editor and then be able to test it right away. That was like super beneficial and super like interesting and stuff. But in terms of what was beforehand, again, it was more like in this general area, I want to have these things. And it wasn't necessarily I want to have it so that it looks like a thing. Yeah. It was more like I want to have it so that it just gets harder over time.
Yeah.
And that kind of mentality shift was like monumental. It was just like, oh, I can actually have it still be like get harder over time, but like be more selective and curated in terms of how it gets there.
I'm trying to think of the first time that I had ever saw one of the levels with a pattern, and I don't remember which one it was, but the one that like sticks out in my mind is the one that there's just a lot of squares that come in towards the center. I don't remember exactly what the name of that level is either.
It might be Ambush.
No, because Ambush has the pacing is different, right?
Oh,
so
yes.
like different category. Different category. So it actually looks almost like an alarm. So like it feels very alarming.
Sure.
Not ambush, but it feels very alarming where there's a ton of red ones or a ton of red squares that come straight towards the center, and it's very fast.
Okay, then that one might be spatial awareness.
Maybe. Sure. But yeah, I think that one because like what I felt in that moment was just like,
Yes. Oh no, yeah, that probably
because there was
awareness.
so much red immediately and it almost took over the entire screen.
Yes.
Which ones were the first patterned ones that you started testing, and were you seeing reactions from folks from the patterns that you were seeing?
Yeah. So actually the very second level that I made was Ambush, which was another pattern-based one because I was like, well, what if I actually made patterns versus trying to make difficulty things. So it was like it was interesting to see how people approached those ones where it was people were trying to figure out a puzzle versus people trying to figure out like a Twitch game.
Yeah, because you have a couple of like different categories of gameplay styles essentially for the levels.
Yeah, definitely. And pattern-based ones are like the combination of the two extremes, I guess, of the levels that are in there, which are puzzle ones that are like strictly puzzle ones, and then more reflex ones. And like, pattern ones are like, oh, can you figure out how to get through this pattern kind of thing, or how to deal with these certain enemies that show up at this point. But then there's squares, and there's always squares.
There's always squares. They're like freaking squirrels. Squirrels.
Going back to squirrels. It's interesting to see how people approached it in like that puzzle mindset, because I've never really seen HyperDot as like a puzzle game. I've always seen it as like, oh, it's an action game.
Yeah.
Where you're avoiding things, you're using like reflexes to avoid things. But I did have like explicit like, oh yeah, these are puzzle ones. But it was interesting to see how people reacted and been like, oh yeah, this is totally a puzzle game. Yeah. And I was like, what? This is what? And genres, I don't know. I mean, yeah, I guess call it what you want. It is what it is at that point. But,
I keep thinking back to like the kind of moment of recognizing that there were all of these different enemies, but then also like the set of enemies were interacting with the I think, nowadays you're calling them modifiers, but back then it always felt like, oh, these are different things that impact your gameplay outside of just the enemies.
Right.
Talk to our listeners a little bit about those. Like I know them really well at this point, I think, because I have feelings about them. Yeah. But yeah.
Yeah. So before I did any of the single player stuff, one of the things that I actually had a 5-phase plan.
You did?
Yes.
Okay,
I had a
please tell me more.
I had a 5-phase plan, and it was, let me see if I remember. I'm getting my phone out. Because I have the note. Phases, there it is. Okay, I have 4. Okay.
So it wasn't 5, it's 4 phases. Okay.
All right. Phase 1 was modifiers.
Okay.
Phase 2 was power-ups.
Okay.
Phase 3 was challenge mode, which then became single player. And then phase 4 was unlocks and feats.
And feats?
These are like achievements.
Oh, like features?
Like achievements and stuff.
Okay. Oh, that type of feats.
Yeah, like feats.
Okay. Got it. Okay.
Yes.
That makes sense.
Yes. And I made this note in May 8th, 2016.
Oh my God. Yeah. Thinking about that, like from a systems architecture, what we will have the clarity and UX conversation.
Yeah.
But like, oh my God, that's so different.
Oh yeah. I was like, oh, okay, these are the things that I'm going to do. And then after this, I'll be done. Because this is
summer.
Yeah, that'll be done that summer. Well, it's only 4 things.
Yeah.
But yeah, the first phase was modifiers. And modifiers are things that change the way the game's played. So that means I believe the very first modifier.
Was it ice?
It was not ice.
Was it dark mode?
It was not dark.
Okay, I'll shut up now.
It was changing the size of the player because it was easy.
Oh, that's not as flashy as I thought.
Yeah, no. The first like modifier that was like not easy because it was just like change the size of the player, change out the speed of the player. Those 2 are easy because I already had access to that.
Yeah.
The ones that I had to actually do effort towards was ice mode and dark mode.
Yeah.
Those were the first 2 that were in. Ice mode is actually the first one of the first modifiers that was in a single player level because endurance is on ice.
Yep. Yes, it is.
Yes, it is. And then also the arena size was also another thing that was able to be changed, which are the 2 things that make up endurance. So modifiers, like I mentioned, are things that change like the landscape of the game. So it was interesting. It was also interesting to have that on top of just like the pure enemy design of like, oh, what if I put a square and a triangle in a room? What do you do then? Yeah.
What? Oh God. Okay. So the designer is like, let's talk about this. Sure. Where did you start? Like, you had modifiers in mind. You had all of these enemy behaviors, right? Mm-hmm. You had your 5 enemies, and I don't remember how many modifiers you currently have. How many?
Now I'm at, I think it's 29 different modifiers.
Oh my God. Okay. Anyways, so 5 enemies, 20, let's say 25
plus.
25 plus modifiers. Yes. Did you just like throw them all together? And you're shaking your head at me.
As soon as it was done, I was like, all right, first 5 days after that, I just said, yeah, here's 100 levels. No problem. We threw them all together.
That's such a lie because I remember you had like 100, you were like, 100 levels. Got there. Yes. And it was like, you were on level 30 or 40 or something. And you're like, I don't know how I'm going to finish 100 levels.
Yeah, that's.
So I know you're lying.
Yeah, no, okay. The process of like combining the stuff was like even from that note from before where I was like, oh yeah, the phases. Single player didn't happen until phase 3. So I was purely focused on multiplayer, and in fact, I was only focused on those first 2 levels that I made before. So like I was only basing my modifier / like enemy design stuff off of those 2 levels. I wasn't thinking, oh yeah, I'll totally be able to make like cool, interesting patterns, or I'll be able to make super interesting combinations based off of whatever the level looks like. That was not the case. Modifiers were supposed to be things that you can turn on and be like, oh, now it's icy, or in multiplayer, I was like, oh, now you're big. So it was more like a party kind of thing.
Yeah. I remember this so clearly now that we're talking about it, because I remember the moment where I walked up to you and I said, random. Like, I choose random.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah. Yeah. Then I believe like it might have been GlitchCon where I added in random. And that was the first time.
I was always going to choose random. It was too... like, I love things to be complex and rich in features, but it was so much to digest right away. Anyways, continue on. I'm sorry. We will go on to that in like the clarity and like the clarity UX episode.
But yeah, so it was a lot of like me just like saying what would be cool as like a party kind of thing. And not necessarily what would be cool as a level design thing. So I got inspiration from a lot of different things. Dark mode was an inspiration from a plugin that I was using in Fingens, my other game that I'm working on with my bro and Lane Davis. That was the plugin is called Super Fast Soft Shadows.
Also made here in Minnesota.
Shout out to Howling Moon Software. That one is it basically is like a 2D your 2D lighting system thing. But I was like, oh, how can I use that in HyperDot or anti-piracy at the time? So I was just like, oh, that would be cool if I added in a mode where it was like nighttime or whatever.
Yeah, it's such a freaking cool mode, and I can't believe it was also one of our mild downfalls in optimization. More on that later.
But yeah, so like I was just like, oh yeah, that's an idea. I got inspiration from other games and stuff in terms of like modifiers and stuff.
What other games and which modifiers?
The most clear, like obvious one is HyperDot.
Oh yeah.
That's where time moves only when you move.
That might sound familiar.
Yeah.
No copyright infringement.
Please don't sue us. No content ID. Yeah, so there's that. Other ones that other failed modifier things that I was inspired by was like, oh, what if I had a Tron like level? Or
I've
modifier.
never heard of this.
Oh yeah, it lasted like half an hour.
What was the Tron like level?
Basically, you would run around and you'd make a trail, and then if you run into the trail, then you'd lose.
Okay.
So yeah, it was like, oh, that would be interesting. The problem is you could just easily corner somebody. Like it was super easy to do that, and then it wasn't any fun.
Yeah, not even fun enough for the multiplayer mode.
Not even fun for multiplayer, because at that point it's just like you lost in 2 seconds, no matter what. Yeah,
because I know people. I can't recall. Is it? I should know this by now after demoing so many times. But the hazardous one. What is the level called right now? Oh my god.
Which Divide?
Divide.
Yeah.
Thank
Divide
you.
Is the...
But yeah, it seems like that's the number one thing that people absolutely love about multiplayer.
Oh yeah.
And so this Tron thing makes me think a lot of like, oh, it can. I see where you were going with it. Like, oh, is it possible to, especially in multiplayer mode?
Yeah, trying
to
have that, like, competitive
compete with the other players. Yeah. Why did it, like you just said, it was not good. Yeah. People were done within 30 seconds.
Yeah. Like you basically just said, I'm going to circle you. And then at that point they couldn't do anything and they run into your trail.
Yeah.
It wasn't like I wasn't super excited about pursuing it. Maybe in like a future update.
Okay, I won't. Like part of me is like, could you have done a trail that's short, like not as long in terms of the duration that it stays on the screen, so that you can't do a circle.
Yes, yeah. So I did try changing like the size and the length and stuff, but like it just
didn't feel right.
It didn't feel right. Okay. At that point, it was less of a, oh, I'm going to use this as an advantage, and more of a, oh, I'm going to this just happens to be a thing.
Yeah. Okay.
But yeah. So there's a ton of failed modifier ideas that I had and stuff like that. That can be down the line that we talk about that stuff. But it wasn't until the single player levels, or the challenge mode. Because actually back in the day, I believe it was just called challenge.
Yeah.
Where I really was like, oh, what if I did combine ice and make a small arena, and then add all the squares and pentagons and triangles in one, and call it endurance.
So when you started doing the modifiers plus all of the enemies, is that the moment where you were like, oh, I want people to feel something about these things?
That was when I saw people feeling things about things.
Feeling things about shapes?
Yeah, feeling things about these shapes. And it wasn't until like Ambush. Ambush was the one when people got there, that was when people hated triangles.
So Ambush is a combination of which modifiers and which enemies?
There are no modifiers in this one, but there are the 3 original enemies in there. So it starts out with a bunch of squares. And then after that, all the squares go away, and then it's pentagons. And then after the pentagons happen, all those go away, and then it's the triangles. And it's the triangles that made people mad. Because the triangles, they follow you around. But actually, no, I think in the original one, I did make you bigger. So then,
it was like your player character, your dot was significantly bigger, and you were also a little bit slower.
Yes, I
remember that.
I believe those 2 were in the original one. I don't remember if that's a fact. I will not check that because I don't think I can. But so like it was then when I saw people like hate on triangles. In fact, I believe the person that I'm working with vengeance on, Lane Davis, was one of the first people who was like triangles. Because I remember having an interesting conversation with him, talking about Ambush in particular.
Yeah. I also freaking hate triangles, but at the same time, crosses.
Yeah, crosses.
Anyways.
Yeah, no. This is feels
So when you are making these levels, now that you have both enemies and also your modifiers, what are you trying to make people feel in terms of each level? Like, where do you even, where are you starting from?
Sure.
Do you think about, like, oh, I want people to feel shocked or surprised at this moment? Do you want them to absolutely hate triangles? Do you, like, talk to me about where you're at now versus where you were at previously? Because I know I feel that way personally.
Sure.
I feel like you are legit talking to me, and you anticipate the moments where I am going to say, screw you, Charles. Why? So like I can tell, but like talk to folks a little bit about, talk to our listeners a little bit about what your process is and what you're thinking.
Sure. When I'm making levels and such, the original, or sometimes it's like the ideas come from me just like messing around with my level editor that I made, and I'm like, oh, what if I did this? And then something interesting happens. Like, oh, what if I made a level around that? Other times it's like I have an idea for that like emotion that you were talking about, where I want to have that surprise, or that like, oh, I just was about to make it, and then suddenly I no longer, or like suddenly something happens and you're like, like dang it, or something like that. I don't know. And so I totally tried to design some levels like that, where you just were about to make it, and then something new and or interesting happened. So a lot of that comes down to the timing of the enemies and which type of enemies show up together. So for instance, triangles, they follow you. So if I have something where, I have a wall of squares, what happens if I do introduce a bunch of triangles that are following you? Now that wall of squares is more intimidating because you have to go around that wall of squares or else you'll run into them. Without the triangles, that wall of squares isn't as interesting because it's just a line of squares. You can avoid that. Just move over to the right and boom, you're done. So like things like that like the process of finding those moments where I can try and like put in some type of like an emotive, like, oh, or like, oh, so close, or things like where I know that at this point you're almost there and you can feel it. But
yeah, like, I remember that was another thing that I said was just one more time. Like that is something that I oftentimes feel, and it definitely is by design, which is just one more time. It was me. It was me, right? Like it was something that I did, and I can change that for the next round.
Yeah, and I definitely did not want to have it so that it was you felt like it was the game that was screwing you over, where it was like it was fair, and I'm clearly telling you, hey, these things are going to happen, or hey, if this happens, you can expect this. So I want to make sure that all of these things, that all of these different things that I can tweak and play with and stuff, that they don't compromise on like your experience of playing it in terms of having like just having fun, or like feeling like the game's cheating you, and things like that.
So what would you want to say to the listeners about having feelings about shapes? What do you hope that they feel about your damn shapes?
Please contact me on Twitter and tell me what is your most hated shape, and tell me why it is the cross. All right.
All right, well, that's it for the episode. You can continue the conversation with us and the Hello Player community at discord.gg/glitch. And don't forget to subscribe to Hello Player on your favorite podcast app. Hello Player is produced by me, Ava Carr, Holly Harrison, Ben Hansen of MinMax, with music done by none other than Charles McGregor. Thank you again for listening, and see you next time.